Okay, so JT, I had a question for you, reflecting on your retail background. How was Black Friday for you?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, my friend. Okay. Black Friday was simultaneously the worst and best day of the year because I worked at Best Buy.
Just before you say this, just explain what it is, because I didn't know for the longest time.
It's like the biggest sale day of the year where, you know, shitty TVs are marked down from their already marked up percentages down to like what you should actually be paying for them. And it drives people insane here. Like there'll be fist fights over Walmart TVs and stuff like that. And you'll be like, see parents trying to tear the last child's toy out of another parent's hand to get the best deal. And it's wild. Look up Black Friday videos on YouTube, dear listener, if you're not familiar with the experience. It's crazy. So I worked at Best Buy, and you know, I worked in the camera department, only supposed to be selling cameras really. But during Black Friday, it was kind of a free-for-all. You were just expected to run around the store and you know, prevent fights and help people get the last whatever, you know, HDMI cable or something like that. So we would have to stock the store the night before, and you know, it was like I worked a closing shift, and then I stayed until like midnight or something to help stock, and then I would come back. I have to come back the following morning because it was basically all hands on deck that day. And so what I did to cope with this, I would always bring a thermos to work to have water on the floor, because you can't really walk off the floor and get water very easily. So for Black Friday, what I'd do is I would instead fill that with a giant vodka lemonade. So I would just be drinking the entire day and interacting with the worst human beings in the United States. And people would be like, "Where are your TVs?" I'm like, "I don't look at the back of the store. You see the TVs back there? You fucking idiot!" They just like scurry past me and go to the TVs.
But sir, there's only one TV here, dude. I see 3 TVs. Sir, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. Oh wait, fuck, there's 6 now. Yeah.
That was Black Friday. I mean, you'd have people. They'd come in. They'd literally run through the store. And you're like, "Man, take it easy. It's not a big deal." But yeah, it turns people into animals here in the States, and it was at the time terrible. Like you had to stay up late and stock the stuff that the people were gonna ransack the next day, and then you'd come back early and sell it to the to the swine who came to suckle at the
like
teat
a village
of
being
capitalism. Yeah. Exactly. And I was amazed that more things weren't broken and knocked over, but. It also has given me some very good memories.
You know, my only like exposure to this is I remember when I first encountered this, whatever this is, this event, and I remember I saw a YouTube video, and it was like you know the movie Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
It looks, it's like glass doors.
Honestly.
And there are people who are pushed up against the glass doors, and the poor worker they don't unlock the door by going behind it.
Right.
They're like, you know, stretching so that, because they know the people will burst forward and they might get fucking stampeded.
That's how it worked. That's how it worked every time at
God.
Best Buy, because you had the giant glass doors, and people they'd queue up, they would get ready, they would be there like an hour early, and there was a line out the parking lot, and it was insane. So the poor sap who had to go and unlock the door and open it got shoved past by you know, all these people. It was an experience, and I wish that you boys could be here and stand and watch with me, you know, from a safe distance, of course.
Maybe one day.
The Black Friday zombie virus has spread to a lot of other segments of the world. So I had the privilege of experiencing it a few times, but I went quite literally just to enjoy seeing orcs up close. And being an orc myself, literally just walking into a shop, not really sitting down because there's nowhere to sit down, and looking 360 degrees around me, how all these people starved for commodities are engaged in basically the closest we get to be to a physical fight without it being violent. And it's kind of like it's almost like a symphony of just absolute insanity developing around you, and everybody's looking at you as if you're the stupid one for not engaging. To me, it's always very surprising how like the oldest marketing trick in the book, which is you take an item and you pretend that you discounted it by quite literally just changing a number that you have on a sticker on said item, and then also online, obviously, in the same sticker.
No, but sticker's not red.
And it sells so fucking hard. And like most people, I think, like consciously know it, but subconsciously can't handle not diving in on the great fucking offer or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and pro tip for anybody who does go shopping on Black Friday, they're never marking down the actual quality products. Like, we would never mark down the nice 4K Samsung TVs and stuff like that. It was like the Vizios and the Best Buy brand, whatever they called it. What was it? Insignia, I think. They'll mark down the junk that's like already not worth that much. So don't do it. Don't risk your life for a garbage TV. It's not worth it, friend.
Oh my god, living in the US must be so much. You go to school, you risk your life.
You go shopping,
you go shopping and risk your life. You go to a hospital, you can't pay, you risk your life. Fucking hard mode. Anyways,
best country on earth,
I have
baby.
a PSA. Yes, that it is. I have a PSA of sorts. Everybody, or at least every woman should know, or everybody with breasts at least, should know that they should do regular palpations. They should check for lumps and stuff like that. If you don't know, then look up a video or a guide. You should know how to do this. But PSA for the guys out there: palpate your nuts. You should feel your testicles. This is very weird and out of left field, but a related patient story that I won't mention today, maybe some other time. But basically, young guy, testicular cancer. That's all you need to know. And I always forget that regular people don't know what their balls feel like. Regular guys don't know what their balls feel like. So usually you end up with two things. Either some dude who has nothing wrong with him, he comes in, he's feeling on his balls, like, oh, there's something weird here, and it's just like his fucking epididymis or something that he's feeling. Or you get some guy who thinks that there's nothing wrong, and you come in and he has like basically a third testicle, but it's a tumor.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And he's just like, oh, I thought this is normal. I thought this is how it's supposed to feel. So please, everybody, palpate your nuts, get a feel for what it's supposed to be like, and just every once in a while, just check down there, just see if everything is as supposed to be.
I check all the time, like 3-4 times a day, you know, like 7-8 times a day. I check my nuts all the fucking time, baby. I get other people to check my nuts. It's
there you go.
can make it into a beautiful experience. No joke. Like, I think I was like 14, 15 when I first heard of that you can get tumor down there, and then I touched my nuts, like really, really touched them, and I felt, you know, the like layer around your nuts that, like, if you squeeze it, it kind of feels like you have something extra, but it's not. It's just your fucking layer, or epidermis. Did you call it that, Hakeem? Right? And
epididymis.
Okay, so I touched the epididymis, and I fucking scared my fucking ass off, and immediately called one of my friends, and he checked it. He also had the epididymis, and we were all screaming at each other on the phone, oh my god, the statistical chance, what the fuck? What statistical chance? We didn't know what statistics were at age 15. We were like, oh my god, we both have fucking tumors, let's go to the fucking doctor and shit. And then we talked to our parents, and they were like, no man, that's just your balls, bro.
Oh my god, that's just these nuts, as we say. And hello everybody, and welcome back to the Deprogram. Today we'll be discussing, this is kind of like a part two.
He said that as if there's like a gun on his fucking forehead. Which there is in the basement of JT. Apologies.
JT has me in his what the fuck is it called? The cellar?
My attic, because apparently they don't exist in fucking Texas.
Yeah. We got too much
Wait,
clay here. It's hard to dig.
Oh, you guys don't have basements?
No, not really.
They don't even have cement on their walls. Like, what the fuck are we talking about?
Oh yeah, that's the weirdest thing about fucking American. Why do you guys just have like drywall? This, you know, I was listening to this thing, and it's a dude who was talking about how he was sleeping, and then he like moved his leg, and he like basically kicked a hole through his wall.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what the fuck? We have like granite walls and shit here. And at first I thought like, god damn, what do these Americans eat? But then I realized that you guys build your fucking walls out of paper. Yeah. No wonder the tornadoes fucking ruin you.
It's cheaper. I mean, it's easy to mass produce and stuff like that. It's, you know, wood framing and brick on the exterior a lot, and like some accent stone. Yeah, it's not not terribly well constructed.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like. And people bitch about Soviet production. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Say what you will. A Khrushchevka, you won't be able to kick a fucking hole through the wall with your foot.
We'll kick a wall through you. But now in America, it's built like that so that white people have what to punch through when they're angry.
Well, that is true.
If they don't punch the walls, we all know what they do. So, the walls have been sacrificed for a greater good.
Your culture is so interesting, JT.
Why do you think Germans did World War II? All their buildings are made out of brick for thousands of years.
Oh, fuck. There we go. Oh, man. What a rich tapestry. All right. Yes, back to the main topic. Today, we're going to be discussing somewhat of a sequel or part 2 to the previous discussion on class. Today, we're going to go over intersectionality and a little bit about labor aristocracy. The main topic, or the main meat, which is as juicy as JT's, that we'll be getting to, is, though, intersectionality. Let's start with that. What does it mean what does intersectionality mean? And several addendums, because the liberals in the walls were very strong when I was writing the stupid notes for this one, okay? We, as Marxists, are materialists. What that means is that material reality is what determines social relations, okay? Our analysis is fluid. It's not a vulgar materialism. It doesn't mean that we only adhere to some sort of reductionist perspective that, the material conditions of something are the sole determinants, but they are the major determinants. What do I mean by this? Class is something that has material basis, and as a result, it is centered within our analysis. But that doesn't mean we should over-prioritize it, and that's kind of the point of intersectionality. There's two sides of this, and then I'm going to get into the meat of this. There's a lot of academic Marxists, especially if you read the recent literature about this, that they have this trend of delinking class from the general analysis and focusing only on the intersections, only on race or sex or sexual identification or other such things, which is a sort of right-wing deviation, if we can even name it that way. And then you have these old-timey orthodox Marxists who are very class reductionist. They think that there's only class. It doesn't matter if you're black. It doesn't matter if you're a woman. It doesn't matter if you're gay. A proletariat is a proletariat, and then as a result, their kind of perspective and plan kind of emerges from there, which is a left deviation of sorts, because that's also incorrect. Okay, so to define intersectionality a bit more, I'm going to give you the two sides of it, right? There are those people, aforementioned academic Marxists, who will usually treat every social factor as distinct. Everything is on its own, and you should take each thing as it comes, not just as a part of a package, let's say. And then you have on the other side, people consider social totality, so race and gender and class, and then those subsections, if immigrations or if they're immigrants or not, disability, colonialism or post-colonial history and the relations with that, other vectors of social power. All of these things, generally, the social totality, are mutually reinforcing social phenomena. What does that mean? That means that even though class is somewhat of the core, the soul, let's say, the flesh around it is your race, your gender, and all these other factors that form this complete totality that we can approach in our analysis. That's the point of intersectionality, to not just get bogged down in the class aspect, but also not to go too deep into the tangents where then class doesn't matter anymore and we end up into a very into the crevice of just basically identity politics. We need more black women as CEOs, instead of focusing on both the class aspect and the racial and gender and whatnot, right?
Yeah, so what Hakim just explained is extremely important, because nowadays people tend to throw shit at each other, considering each other either the left deviation or the right deviation, and never really believing that you can embrace intersectionality how it was originally intended to be embraced, as Hakim said, as a totality. So be very concerned when in a discussion with mostly usually very young or new Marxists, when they deviate either very far to the left or to the right when it comes to intersectionalist theory. Anybody listening to this that went through university and, for example, studied anything relevant to social sciences or even very specifically political science will realize that Hakim is 100% on the nose. I remember personally first interacting with this in my second year of poli-sci and writing an essay which is very concentrated on the class analysis. I believe at that time it was weapon ownership, and the professor literally deducted grades from my paper due to it concentrating exclusively on class and not on other aspects which they believed were extremely relevant for said situation. And they were most likely correct, because back then, everything evolved around classroom, because I come from a relatively mono-ethnic part of the world where, other than imperialism, those sorts of topics never really interested me in my youth, because I didn't get to interact with shit like that. And probably a lot of people have similar experiences. So either they have hardcore experiences with the social aspects of class analysis, race, culture, immigrant status, imperialism, etc., etc. So obviously, it's absolutely natural and absolutely fine for them to, feel more intensely when talking about issues which relate to those things. But we always need to remember the way the brilliant mind of Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings. So all of those things that you feel very intensely about are innately linked at its core, which we're going to go more deeply further on, to class distinction. And the opposite, now talking about me as a much younger Marxist, if you happen to be the majority in a certain country, and if you happen to not really interact with those social aspects of oppression and only class oppression, it's normal for you to massively concentrate on only that aspect. But that is why we have terms, and that is why we have theories, such as, for example, in this case, intersectionality, which allow us to see further from the scope of our own personal experiences. So once you don't even deep dive, I think from this episode you will see that it's a relatively simple and very, very truthful analysis of the material reality that people live through. When you embrace it, you will basically get to experience life through a lot of other eyeballs, which the material reality in which you are in doesn't allow for. And that is why it's extremely important, because no matter which, be it class, which is at its core, or the 20 different things that are born out of class struggle, no matter which one out of those impacts you, you need to realize that without genuinely solving, quote unquote solving, you get what I mean, all the rest, you will never truly at the core address one of those 20 problems which are core to what you're pissed off about on a daily basis. And that's why today's episode, and in general intersectionality, really matters. It gives you scope.
Yeah.
What an intro. Proud of you both. You both get an extra hour of daylight outside the dungeon today. Well done.
Thank you, Daddy. Thank you. Yay.
Thank you, JT.
You see Bob, he's going to let us out, Bob. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to ride myself some horses. I'm going to ride some horses. Yeah.
We're going to get an extra Pop-Tart. Or what are the
Pop-Tarts?
Oh my God.
We're going to go see Jenny from the block.
I love that this is your vision of the United States.
I have been there, and my vision is correct. I'm okay.
Oh my God!
I'm kidding.
My image is potholes and people wearing the hat, the cowboy hat, the one with the bend in the middle, and everybody wears denim.
Honestly,
I imagine
the reason Hakeem doesn't like cowboy hats is because he has that insane Iraqi hairstyle. You can put no fucking hat on top of it. So that's why he's
3 feet off his head. Yeah.
Exactly right. Oh fuck. Oh man. Oh jeez. Anyways, yes, and of course, I also imagine JT in full denim wear. I imagine you with a denim cap, the denim shirt, and the denim pants.
Denim pants, denim socks, denim underwear. Hell yeah.
But then when he wants to go sexy time, he puts the leather on the crotch and the leather on the nips.
There we go.
And like a leather strip on the cowboy hat, and then we
ride,
baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's getting too hot in here. We need to cool down. All right, back on track. Sorry, just because there's so much bullshit to get through. we'll move throughout, don't worry. I completely agree, beautifully put, with what Yugopnik said, and I just to tie it up into one sentence, the reason that we put the emphasis on this social totality, again, as I mentioned, race, class, gender, and all the subsections, of course, together in part of the analysis, is because if you only focus on one, then you'll diminish your level of understanding of social power and oppression. right? What does this mean? I'll give an example. For example, black working class in the United States versus the white working class in the United States have fundamentally different experiences as a result of this racial vector or intersection, right? This is where the nuance comes in. A class reductionist will tend to think about this as, oh yeah, well, both of them are proletarian. So as a result of this, the fundamental axiom that that their oppression is based off of is the fact that they have to sell their labor power, and as a result, the conditions that they have to endure are similar. Or at least the levels of oppression that they have to endure are similar. But in reality, we know that blacks have higher unemployment rates, blacks are discriminated against more at work, blacks are the first to be fired and the last to be hired, blacks have at equal levels of education, at equal levels of experience, they get paid less than a white coworker. And if you go back to other settler colonial states like South Africa, for example, the difference was even more stark. And the fundamental difference between these two populations, despite the fact that they're both proletarian, and even though sometimes both of them are unionized, the black worker is usually at the more brutal end of capitalist oppression, let's say. Not always 100% of the time, but the vast majority of the time. And that's where one of the axioms comes in, or one of the intersections, excuse me. Do you guys have anything to say about that?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. There have been plenty of studies here in the United States where people will do a social experiment where they'll take the same resume and they'll put a quote unquote white sounding name and a quote unquote black sounding name and submit them. And every single time the black sounding name is offered in an interview way less of the time. It's a stark difference. And this is a society where people think, oh, we've fixed racism, et cetera, et cetera. That's definitely not the case. And so even no matter what your level of education, what your level of experience, if you are not a white male, then you're going to have degrees of extra difficulty that are not placed on the what a lot of Americans see as the default human being in the United States. And that's something that's absolutely needs to be taken into account.
Yes, very well put. There's one aspect that I would also like to comment on that kind of relates to this, because a lot of modern, I don't want to call it even Marxist, it's usually post-left nonsense. By the way, the vast majority, I dare say all post-left stuff, is garbage. You should never waste your fucking time on it. It's absolute garbage. One thing that's recently popped up from this fucking garbage heap is the concept of the Precariat. Guy Standing was one of the people who popularized these. And the idea being...
I always laugh at the name Guy Standing, because I just imagine just some dude just hanging out.
Yeah, he should have kept standing instead of talking, but okay.
Yeah. Continue, I'm sorry.
Yeah, honestly, Jesus Christ.
I'll laugh quietly.
No, you're completely right. It's completely fine. But yeah, the concept of the Precariat is this, right? That the current... system, the class system in the United States, for example, has become more stratified, and as a result of the precariousness of employment that the vast majority of American quote-unquote working class people experience, that this undermines the importance or the relevance of the traditional concept of the working class. But the thing is that he's a fucking idiot. The reason that he's a fucking idiot is because the working class and their politics and influence has always been precarious, and it's always been at the mercy of the capitalist state or the capitalist class as a whole. To say that all of a sudden, just because employment subjectively, by the way, if you look at the actual evidence, this is not really that shown, unless you're looking specifically at highly educated jobs amongst white middle class and upper middle class technical specialists or people in university and stuff like that. Outside of these realms, work has been as precarious as it's always been for the most part. In fact, in some aspects, it's become less precarious, and other aspects it's become more. My point being, though, if you do want to lay blame on one aspect or another within the United States, then it's the decline of unionism and the decline of union membership, which has kind of eroded these protections that American workers used to have. And that's one of the reasons that the subjective increase in precarity has been noticed. But that doesn't negate the fact that you're still working class.
It doesn't bring absolutely anything new to the table when it comes to the discussion of class relation. It just says that in this particular moment in time, one thing that the proletariat has not experienced as much before is being experienced now more. But how does that change class relations? You cannot. Class relations are based on what one class does to another and what one class gets from the other class, but rates of employment,
and their
or
relations,
how easy it is to get a job or not get a job, or the fear of losing a job, that does not change the said original relations. So it's not even post-left. It's okay. You can add it as another aspect, but it's not different. It doesn't overlap. It doesn't change.
It's not a materialist analysis. Exactly right. This is based in absolute nonsense that is wishy-washy, and you can't base your scientific analysis of this based on these kind of criteria. And that's why he's a fucking idiot. So that's just something, because on occasion when you see, in a lot of discussion of intersectionality, you enter into quote-unquote post-left spaces where you start seeing other rhetoric that's all fucking stupid. And this is one of the issues where liberals kind of appropriate Marxist terminology and then just run with it. And then they make, So this is just one important thing to notice. One aspect of intersectionality that is important is it's kind of a counterweight to the Eurocentrism that is present within Marxism. I dare say even like to this day it's still present, but back in the day it was a lot more. I'll give several examples and then we can just have a bit of a discussion about it. Even to this day you see this, but this was much more common 100 years ago. The idea that the revolution, the centrality of industrialized Europe and its importance for revolution. The idea that revolution can be in China or Russia or India or the Middle East or Latin America, this was completely alien to people. In fact, if you look at some of the declarations of the Comintern, the first few declarations of the Comintern, you can see this two-line struggle. The Lenin's line, which was the correct line, that there is a concept of labor aristocracy, that the revolution can erupt outside of the industrial core, despite the fact that his opinion earlier was different, but towards the latter end of his life he started changing the opinion, like around 1923. And then you see this other line, which is propagated by, amongst other, Trotsky, who we should probably censor the name of. Spit on the ground, Trotsky. And the idea that the revolution, no matter what happens outside, without the victory of the revolution within the industrialized countries, then it's absolutely pointless to try to have socialism elsewhere. So that's part of the Eurocentrism. Another aspect was this racism that was partly Eurocentric, of course, within Western communist parties. The French Communist Party is a perfect example of this. They didn't want to give independence to Algeria. They stuck with the, Algeria is French bullshit. They didn't have good politics on the French Indochina question. Ho Chi Minh spent a good deal of his time basically roasting and schooling French Marxists on this question, and they never corrected their line, even into the late 60s. They never corrected the line. That's why the French are, the French. Right? And then you also have this racism that was ever present even within American unions, leftist American unions. This has its own background. For example, a lot of the time, because the employment or the unemployment levels of black people in the United States have always been very high, they would be used also frequently as strike breakers for when the white workers would go on strike. And as a result, this turned a lot of unemployed black people that would be basically lumper proletariat that would be called up to as temporary labor while white laborers or workers are striking. This caused this tension within the working class movement that all these blacks do is whenever they come just to be what is it called in English, a scabs, the one who just like exactly,
they inherently
and they do
don't
this out
have
of economic necessity.
Yeah.
And also, of course, this is a economic necessity. Otherwise, these people would be starving. So just to kind of like lump this all together, the point of intersectionality is to break this Eurocentrism, this racism that was in unions, this bullshit in other Western communist parties that, at least back in the day, and at least somewhat even to this day, to bring in these different perspectives and to deepen the analysis, to understand that, hey, just because we're all proletarian doesn't mean we all have the same struggle one-to-one. And I was just wondering about you guys. Maybe you've had personal experiences with this, or...
To me, it's extremely prevalent to this day, especially as people who do our type of work online. I have noticed, because of my interaction with Western communists being the group which I interact with the most, because they happen to have the most time to be online and happen to have the most resources to be online and happen to have a culture of internet consumption which is much higher than in a developing world. So there is a sense of how do I put this? The only real revolution needs to come from our parts of the world because everything else is pretend. You know, we like to joke here on the Deprogram that the US is the main game and everything else is a DLC. The only time in the eyes of these people, and some of them with well-meaning, the only time when Marxism can be perceived as a ideology which can cover the whole globe is after it was successful in our part of the world. This sort of idea that if we, the genuine, full game experience, the genuinely civilized nations embrace Marxism, eventually everyone else will embrace it. It's kind of a leftover thought that Europe originally was the one that spread civilization to everywhere else. So Europe was also the one where the French Revolution happened, and then it inspired national revolutions all over the world. Europe this, Europe that. So now Europe being extended to, I would even say, overshadowed by the US, the only way for the globe to truly become red is if we here are the ones painting the world red after our local revolution. I don't know if you guys have kind of felt this because it's more of a gut thing. I can't really bring up statistics that prove it, but the reason why it's so powerful and interesting is that it like these are communists, sometimes very well-read communists, that hold these just bygone attitudes, and they don't even know they hold them because it's the Eurocentrism in them, the US centrism at this point has been so strong from generation to generation that it's difficult to just get rid of it only because you got some class consciousness. And intersectionality can really, for example, help finding some biases in you that you didn't even really know that you had. At least it helped me a lot.
Yeah, there are some very patriarchal notions in various sections of the left here in the United States, especially. I would say that, I don't want to name any names, but certain figures kind of promote the idea that look, all these other socialist experiments are doing it wrong. Like their version of Marxism is incorrect, and we have to be the shining light that leads people into the real, utopian socialism that we can achieve only here in the United States because we're so enlightened, et cetera, et cetera. We're not barbarians. Is the kind of implicit thing that they're suggesting there, and that's I think. Thankfully, that doesn't resonate with the entire Western left. I think more and more we are seeing an acknowledgement that places like Africa and Latin America have incredibly well-developed philosophy when it comes to developing their own forms of socialism and following a proper Marxist line, whereas a lot of Western quote-unquote leftists are strictly revisionist, frankly.
Yeah, that's true. And even the well-meaning people who still like to have this idea as, everybody else is doing it right. And their perspective is, we are a highly industrialized nation that once we, we'll do X, Y, Z, we'll do 1, 2, 3. And as a result, our socialism will be more full-bodied. It will be deeper. We'll actually abolish the commodity form and we'll do X and Y and, all that bullshit, right? Which is very interesting. And I'm glad that people have very, vibrant imaginations. But even if you're well-meaning, get it done, and then, because there's all this criticism without substance, right? They'll criticize Vietnam or China or Cuba or something, which, by the way, is part of this Eurocentric aspect heavily. Because if, for example, Norway next week was doing what China was doing or Cuba is doing, people would go insane, right? Especially all these people who are all of a sudden, they would flip overnight. And it is really just a kind of a sad remnant of this Eurocentric trend. But again, like even those people who are truly well-meaning and truly consistent in their approach of analysis of those other countries, I think that at the end of the day, cool, you have your criticisms, that's perfectly fine. But without substance, it doesn't really matter. If you don't have an organization, if you're not developing towards anything, if you're not developing any sort of new theory or something, or most importantly, if you don't have any material organizations on the ground that are bringing some sort of change in your country, then I don't think you have the full right to just kind of sit on your ivory tower or in your armchair, either or, and just basically give these dictates down to the lowly browns or yellows or blacks or whatever else about how they should be doing socialism.
Yeah, it strikes me as very, disingenuous when like places like the United States have never had their own socialist project. It's not been developed here. So the fact that we have a bunch of 17-year-olds here telling places that are building socialism how to run their own countries is a little silly.
And there's a way bigger trend. There's actually a book on Eurocentrism and Marxism. But there's a way longer discussion than we have time for right now. But this was just a small, taste of that. But moving on to again the core of intersectionalism or intersectionality. The example I gave before, the definition, is the one that I think is the best way of understanding it, even though like some people don't like it, but I don't care. This is the one that I'm most comfortable with, and it's that class is the kernel, it's the core component, the soul, quote unquote, and around it you have all these intersections of gender or race or everything else, right? And that's quote unquote the flesh, right? But at the end of the day, you can't take out the core and just have the rest, and you can't just rip off the flesh and just have the core. It is again a full-bodied substance, of an entire entity that you need to approach in the analysis, right? What's most important about this, though, is these these intersections. They're firmly placed within class. Now, what do I mean by this? The very fact that a woman or a black person or a gay person that is a capitalist and their experience versus a working class woman or working class black person or working class gay person, how fundamentally different their experience is. And this goes back even 100 and 150 years ago, right? A example that came to mind right now, it didn't come to mind when I was writing this, but I was just thinking about it right now, is what's her name? The Kardashian person, trans person, what's their name?
I have no idea.
No clue.
Bruce Jenner. Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner. Sorry, I couldn't remember the name. That is, and their experience, right? They continued mixing amongst their high circles with all the wealth and everything that they have, and their experience was fundamentally that of a white person, white trans person. Now, if you were to compare this to, for example, a black trans person, poor black, like a working class black trans person, their experience is so fundamentally different on so many differing levels, despite the fact that they share the intersection together, right? Oh, they're both trans people, but the substantial difference is, of course, relayed by their class, and then to a lesser extent also by other criteria. Of course, Caitlyn Jenner is a white person, I believe at least, and this hypothetical, we're speaking of a black person, and that's kind of the core of the matter. Even if you have people who are parallel in their intersections, it's two women or two gay people, for example, the class component is what is the truly, how do you say this in English? It is what defines the core of their relations to their society at the end of the day, right? Because again, the material basis for it in relation to the means of production is what's determining all of this. Again, that doesn't change the fact that those other aspects, the intersections, are important to be and things we need to deal with and to analyze and to contend with and to have conversations about. But also, just because to say, like, for example, the LGBT movement or a African American movement or whatever else, other minority movements, to put them and paint them in one banner without the class component basically renders them impotent. And the perfect example of this was the Black Lives Matter protests, in which basically what started as somewhat of a working class movement was very quickly co-opted by, exactly the types that co-opted it, and as a result it ended up being basically dead in the water. You have some people who would go on a bunch of talk shows and then would mix with, I don't know, fucking celebrities and shit like that, and then in the end nothing came of it. There's no new legislation, there's nothing that's been changed about the way American police approach minorities. In fact, I believe they've been further demilitarized. The defund police movement has went the exact opposite way. The prisons are still filled to the brim, highly overrepresented by people of particular minorities, etc., etc. And that's kind of the fundamental aspect of why class is important, because otherwise you end up with this.
Yeah.
Here's something that I'd like to kind of open up the floor to, right? And it's these intersections, for example, gender or race or whatever, can they sometimes supersede class? Can they become more important than the class background? And the example I thought of were, for example, Jews in Nazi Germany. It didn't really matter if you were a capitalist and wealthy Jew in Nazi Germany, you're still targeted. And this is an interesting kind of like switcheroo on the entire aspect or the entire idea. And if you really think deeply about it, there's ironically a class component behind this. But I was just wondering, what do you guys think?
To me, it would, again, at the root core, be about class. And Hakeem kind of teased it. I mean, fascism is a reply to capitalism in decline, where class collaboration and hierarchy become all. In order for the hierarchy to condense around one individual or one group of individuals which shall rule over everything, you need to find patsy A, B, or C. In the case of the Nazi version of fascism, the main patsy, not the only, but the main patsy was the Jew. So therefore, you could say, as capitalism was crumbling, the reply to capitalism's crumbling was a class issue. Fascism was born. Fascism needed to find an enemy to unite everyone against, which is not based on class, and therefore it found it in a social, cultural, and religious, to an extent, group during the pogroms and afterwards World War II. So in a very elongated way, yes, it goes back to the root cause of class, but after the pogroms and the mass murders started, then it was destruction and Holocaust for the sake of Holocaust, right? Then the being a Jew became the main aspect, and class was put pretty much forgotten when it comes to an interaction with a person of Jewish heritage or what they defined as Jewish blood. But it does not mean it did not stem from, a class core, if you want to call it that. And I don't think that would be class reductionist to say, but because, the Jews specifically were targeted. But does it have a class core? Yes, absolutely it does have a class core. You cannot have fascism without a class core. You really can't.
I was going to say, fuck, I love when you talk dirty to me. Sorry. Yeah. But no, exactly. Those are exactly my thoughts. Very, very beautifully put, Yugopnik. And interestingly also, something to kind of loop back around a bit on an earlier point. When we think about this aspect of which one of the intersections, they kind of supersede class, in certain segments they can. And another example that I thought of earlier was, for example, in the United States, is the statement of black workers are the last hired and the first fired. They have faced more unemployment rates, etc., etc. And there's this tacit social acceptance within society of a higher black unemployment rate, especially when compared with white people. And in this way, of course, there's this class background to this, like with everything, but it's fundamentally, to me, it's interesting that when we think about, for example, unemployment, when we think of black people and them being more unemployed, there's kind of a higher tolerance, threshold of tolerance for how much that would be, even on like an official level within the United States, which is interesting to note. I was just wondering, JT, if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, so this it's an interesting one, because if you take the kind of ruling class perspective on race in the United States, this country was founded quite literally on the backs of slave labor brought over from various parts of the world to be the workforce for building this country. So in that sense, black people have always been seen as a separate class unto themselves here in the United States. So in that sense, I can certainly see that if we look at it from that lens, then it's still very much a class thing. However, that is obviously, not the case. Like, black people themselves do not constitute some separate class. It's just a long-standing prejudice. So, yeah, I would say that it to an extent does the identity of being black in the United States does supersede class to an extent. I would put a big asterisk on that, though. I would not say that's every case.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. It ends up falling into this layer of nuance where the analysis has to get a lot deeper. But that's the point of intersectionality, because if you were working based off of solely a class reductionist perspective, then you wouldn't really be able to explain this. You can't explain this only on the basis of class, and that's the point of the importance. Now, this I want us to lead into another thing that I want to open up to the floor for you guys for all of us to discuss is, with this, knowing this, should there be individual organizations for the various intersections? Should there be a black-only workers' organization? Should there a woman-only, etc., etc.? And of course, there's a bit of the socialist history of this, but we can get into that afterwards. What do you guys think?
I don't know.
I think it is important for these groups who do experience marginalization based on their characteristics to have their own spaces where they can organize amongst themselves and feel safe. I think that's incredibly important, and to offer a place for people who share that same discrimination to come and feel included and not feel judged by outsiders. That being said, it is intensely counterproductive if those groups remain insular. It's very important to have an intersectional approach to organizing among discriminated communities, because if one group is facing a certain added pressure from the ruling class, for example, the trans community right now is facing tremendous pressure in the United States. If you have these other groups that are like, well, I'm not trans, I don't, that doesn't really affect me. If there's no solidarity there, then not only will the trans community suffer for a lack of support, but as soon as the Eye of Sauron switches to whatever other marginalized group, maybe the trans community will be like, well, they didn't support us during our oppression. Why should we stick our necks out for them? We just need to reconsolidate, recuperate, and wait for the next time. So it is very important that these spaces exist, but there also has to be a solidarity between them, and class is the thing that links them a lot of the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bravo.
I was gonna say I liked both your answers because your answer is very beautiful, JT, and you just said I don't know, and I really like that as well, because that really is the crux of the matter. Even though everything you said, JT, I completely agree with, it depends on the situation. There are certain situations where united front organizations basically make more sense, and there are some cases where you just kind of individual organization also makes more sense. It really depends. But exactly like you said, if there are various organizations that have different perspectives, then there needs to be the solidarity between them, so that there can be, if need be, there can be a united front approach, that we can go entirely as one unit, despite the fact that we're made of smaller individual institutions or organizations. If you look at the history of various leftist movements, you'll see an interesting parallel. The radical traditions around the world, if it was in China, if it was in Russia, if it was in Cuba and Vietnam, for minorities, for example, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, etc., and for women, they would have individual organizations that were usually, I don't want to use the word subservient because that has a strange connotation, but I mean, they were underneath a wider umbrella organization, basically. For example, in the Soviet Union, you had different autonomous groupings that would then make up their own autonomous republics, but they had their politics were entirely autonomous and kind of sectioned off. They worked with their own stuff. And then they collaborated with this umbrella organization at the higher levels of government. this makes a lot of sense. But when you flip over to the US, you see the inverse trend of, for example, like Malcolm X's organizations, which all of them, aside from the very last one that he wanted to begin, but sadly was assassinated by the FBI, by the way, before he could really get it off the ground, all of them were black only. Except for the very last one. If you look at the Black Panthers as well, they were a black-only organization. They had other parallel organizations, sister organizations that were for other people, but the Black Panthers themselves were only for black people. And I understand this as well because, for example, if you look at unions back in the day, there were some unions that were started by black people for black people, and then white workers would come in, and then slowly but surely the white workers would end up being the basically majority of the leadership, and as a result they would kind of take over the organization despite the fact that it was started by African Americans. That's not to say that, you know, we think of like racial domination in organizations as a thing, but also you need to realize that these things at the end of the day matter, especially for the minority grouping, less so for the majority grouping. So all this comes into a big, you know, nuanced ball of, well, it depends. Should we have individual intersectional organizations? It really does depend on the situation. Our history is filled with many approaches. So read.
Yeah, and just to make this even more
the advice there.
To make this even more confusing, we can't forget that there's often a mixture of interacting minority groupings. So, for example, you might have someone who is both black and transgender, and so that's there's another level of nuance that goes even deeper than what we've talked about here.
No, exactly right. And that's why it's important that all these things happen not only in discussion with other comrades, but it should happen in discussion with people of the relevant groupings as well that we're discussing. So it is a dialogue in collaboration with, rather than directives that are sent down to. So that's another thing, an important aspect of the, you know, Eurocentrism question as well, which was how a lot of organizations were organized earlier. Now, kind of to get a bit closer to not wrapping up the episode, but wrapping up the intersectionality aspect, even if all of the intersections, racial, gender, etc., were eliminated, and absolute complete equality in those terms was achieved, then at the very end, you'll have two people, regardless of their gender and race or whatever, everything has been made equal in this hypothetical, you'll have two people that have their surplus value extracted by a capitalist, which is the fundamental shortcoming of over-focusing on just the intersections, right? That's why class is a core component of this, because even if we achieve absolute equality in all other regards, then the lowest you're going to get to, the lowest common denominator, will be the proletarian aspect, which will still need to be contended with. And this kind of brings into the question, which was kind of fought with in the Marxian feminist movement, or the proletarian feminist movement, which is, when should we deal with these things? Should we deal with these things, start dealing with them now, immediately, or should we wait until after the revolution to start with this? And one of the aspects of the conversations at the time was, for example, the idea of women and female oppression and all that kind of stuff. Should we start work even before the revolution, or should we wait until the revolution is victorious, and then we start these sort of things? What do you guys think?
It's when class is not a core component of your analysis, then and I mean absolutely every single other form of identity can be turned into a reactionary tool of which pushes us to not concentrate on said class. So when you do not have it as your main element of analysis, then the struggle of group A can be defined as, for example, why the fuck are we solving the shit for group C? We still haven't solved our own shit. And then group C is like, look at what they're talking about us. And group D is like, look at these motherfuckers fighting. Then we should try and solve our shit, etc., etc. And then you end up having a massively liberal approach towards making the world an inch better. Which at the end of the day, even if it does lead to some sort of productive outcome, will never lead to the genuine solvency of the main issue, which is class. And ironically, the closer a particular society gets to solving class issues and discussing class in general, the faster the status quo encourages the discussion of all other things except class very violently, and usually leads to as I said previously, reactionary movements, etc., etc. But all of this does not mean that you should say, okay, until we get a Marxist revolution, we should shut the fuck up and not talk about all the other extremely important facts of life which influence the majority of the population, if we can address them at the moment. But it is very important to not allow it to be co-opted by capitalism. So you have the black struggle, and then it's co-opted by motherfuckers like, I don't know, Jay-Z and Beyonce, and you get black capitalism as the answer to black struggle. Just pick yourself up, and you can then be the white man's boss. It doesn't have to be the other way around. The literal centuries-long LGBTQ struggle for independence, for the right to marry, for the right to have children, etc., etc., was to an extent won in certain other countries, but then quote unquote class traitors inside of those movements decided that, okay, now when we won enough rights that are okay for us, we should start de-radicalizing the LGBTQ plus movement, and we should no longer we should de-radicalize, because it will get to a point at which class is at an intersection with sexual identity, and that is something that absolutely terrifies us. So, said very simply, yes, we should address everything that we can from all of those intersections when we have the chance, when we have the material conditions to do so. But we need to be very, very careful, because it's shown time and time again that, be it the liberal or the conservative or the fascist, they can eat up and integrate said social issues into their movement very, very easily. The only thing they cannot integrate is class, and that is another reason why it's so important. Because if a movement is talking about class, you can know for sure that they're your ally. They're not just trying to create another consumer demographic for motherfucking capitalism.
Exactly. That's gorgeous. Another hour of sunlight.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I've got a video on how capitalism kind of defangs these radical movements like Black Lives Matter, and you're exactly correct in thank you in that assessment. And it's so, yeah, we do need to be aware that without that kind of class consciousness and solidarity, it is going to be difficult to prevent capital from subsuming these movements for radical change. But also, like Ugopnik said, we do need to be careful not to just kick the can down the road and say, oh, eventually after the revolution we'll address these problems. We need to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time.
Contend with these things.
Especially because just literally 10 seconds. Because, I criticize this one side. The other one absolutely needs to be criticized again. People say, okay, post a class revolution, we're going to address all that shit. Trust me, my friend, in my part of the world, a lot of motherfucking bigotry stayed over after we had class revolution. So it's not a snowball effect in both regards. If not everything is addressed, then you cannot actually have a ball that gets to roll and get bigger. It ends up having cuts, it ends up being a box. Try pushing a snow box down a fucking mountain, you'll see what you'll get.
Yeah, no, in a very funny way, you're completely right, yeah. And that's why the general approach, again, depends on the situation, just like Ugopnik said. But the groundwork, before the revolution, the groundwork can always be laid. The theory can be written, you can do the analysis, you can have the stats, you can break down how things work, etc. But at the end of the day, the most major change can happen when you have political power. right? And that can happen maybe very rarely before the revolution, but usually happens after the revolution. So again, it depends on the particular circumstance that we're talking about. There's some things that you don't need political power to sort out. But for example, the systemic racism, institutionalized, racism within the United States that keeps blacks systemically unemployed and more incarcerated and more killed by police, etc., etc. This is something that you need political power to be able to deconstruct. This is not something that a bunch of blog posts and YouTube videos and protests will solve, sadly, even though it's been done for the past 100 years that these movements have tried to take off. But yeah, I had a little bit also going about socialist failings despite focusing on class, but Yupney kind of touched on it, that there is a lot of bigotry despite the fact. So we can skip this bit. We're probably going to do more devoted episodes to faults of former socialisms, despite the one that we already did. There's way more that we could cover. So for right now, I think we can skip it. Is that okay with you guys?
Sure.
Да, друг товарищ.
All right. Now I want to quote, I want to deliver one quote from a book. This is a book titled Intersectional Class Struggle, which I skimmed before we prepared the notes for this episode. Just before I do give the quote though, I highly suggest you don't read this book. Don't get it. Everything that is decent in this book, I've extracted and already presented to you. All right. It's the typical the fucking can't get published without syndrome. So basically,
how much does it cost? $10?
I don't know.
$20?
It's probably $10.
Okay.
I don't fucking know.
He just saved you $10. Consider going to our Patreon. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Honestly,
standing opening a beer, and I ran back to my microphone just to deliver this line. That's how much I made it for the money, bro.
He's not wrong. Anyways, the reason that this book is such garbage is, number one, the author has very weird ideas about Marxist conception of class. At one point, they consider them like a class reductionist. At another point, they have this weird fucking esoteric interpretation of Marx's ideas. Very weird. They don't mention Lenin once, which is arguably he was the most important developer of Marxist class analysis and even intersectional, by the way. But instead, this stupid fucking author decides to reference Proudhon and Kropotkin and fucking Trotsky, like garbage, right? They criticize irrelevantly Mao's China, like completely out of the blue. They're talking about something unrelated. Then they bring in Mao's China and unconstructively criticize it. Basically, the typical cringe fucking criticism you see. And funnily enough, if you on the back cover of the book, the author has used a Cultural Revolution icon on the fucking cover. So this, which is just like the stupidity. Furthermore, they go on to publish to praise the Arab Spring, which is again fucking big brain rot moment, in which this person seems to be under the delusion that there was working class organizations in Egypt and Tunisia and stuff that led those, which was absolutely not true. There was no organization. That's where they rapidly devolved. And this is the fucking the kicker. This dumb fuck called the Russian Revolution the Bolshevik counter-revolution. Fucking oh my god, dude! I actually I was reading this book. I was like, yeah, this guy's an idiot, but he has like a few good bits and pieces. And then the second I saw this, I had to stand up. And I was like, oh my god, like I get it. You can't get published without writing this shit. I understand, right? Even in leftist publishers, you can't get published without writing stupid shit like this. But you could ease up on it a bit, because when you write Bolshevik counter-revolution, I completely know what kind of person you are, an idiot. But anyways, I'll give you the quote now. But the reminder: don't buy this book. Therefore, we argue that the class divide is, in part, enforced and constructed by factors of race and gender. The structure of capital needs to create profit by exploiting unwaged labor, often that of women, which undermines women's social standing in other spheres. Similarly, racial capitalism enforces strict racial divides in the working class, forcing black workers and workers of color into secondary job markets and segregate the social positions, and rewarding white people with a psychological wage, quote-unquote, a position of social privilege that hinders class solidarity. And so too with queer workers, immigrant workers, and the elderly or young, and on and on. These types of working experiences and social positions based on wage, property, race, gender, and sexuality are class. This diversity of experience in capitalism defines class. That's the general quote. There's a few things that's problematic with the way this person's formulated it, but the general gist of the intersectional aspect, I think, is delivered very nicely in this paragraph. So now I think we can close off this topic of intersectionality. We have just but barely scratched the surface. There's a lot more we could discuss, but I think now we can just have a very quick discussion of labor aristocracy, or the concept thereof, because this is something we're going to make a way bigger devoted episode to later down the line, and we're also going to probably try to do episodes with some guests.
Exactly.
Zach Cope is definitely number one on that list. I would the things I would do to that man if I would meet him. But yeah, so that will happen one day. But now, labor aristocracy. Are you guys comfortable with this? With moving on now?
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna hit you with another quote. This is a quote from Zach Cope, the aforementioned Giga Chad, from his book The Wealth of Some Nations, The Wealth of Some Nations, which I highly recommend you guys get. So I'm gonna read the quote because this is kind of the best labor aristocracy definition that I liked. To put it that way. The labor aristocracy refers to that group of wage earners whose relatively high wages, regular employment, decent working conditions, realistic prospects for career advancement, and or cordial relations with supervisors and managers sets their living standards far above the mass of proletarians. In political terms, the labor aristocracy spurns labor internationalism in favor of seeking rapprochement with the political and economic institutions of imperialism. Even where economic crisis sometimes impels the labor aristocracy to repudiate this, sometimes tacit, sometimes overt, class compact with employers and the government, it does not acknowledge its material and political debt to the exploited workers of the colonial and semi-colonial countries. Instead, the labor aristocracy prefers to focus on national, quote-unquote, democratic redistribution of value obtained by means of imperialism, including, especially, colonialism, unequal exchange, and capital export to low-wage countries. So, real social democracy hours. This is why I love this quote, and this is why I love this man. Let's break down what he said. Basically, the concept of labor aristocracy is there are certain stratums of the working class, particularly in the Western imperial core, even though the imperial core isn't only in the West, but just for ease of the definition, that have a relationship with the ruling class that is has shifted their class interests closer to the interests of their own national working class, ruling class, excuse me. And as a result of this, they when there is working class struggle within these countries, it's less along the lines of international solidarity and we need to, decouple from these systems of imperialism, these systems of basically cheap labor abroad and using third world countries or imperial periphery countries solely for low cost commodities and raw materials and whatnot and agricultural labor. Instead, we should have this kind of cooperative development with them where our industrialized country should help them industrialize their own countries, and in return there's this mutually beneficial relationship. Instead of all this, when there is a working class struggle within these countries that have labor aristocracies, it's fundamentally shifted to, hey, we want a bigger piece of the imperialist pie. We want more basically exactly as Zach Cope said, national democratic redistribution of that is produced by imperialism. And they of course usually don't think of or consider or even acknowledge the effort or the debt that they have to the exploited workers of these colonial, semi-colonial, these imperial periphery countries. The concept is actually very broad. There's various authors that have discussed this. There's Emmanuel Arguri, or Arguri Emmanuel. I've seen it written both ways. I don't know which one's his fucking first name. Zach Cope, Lenin, Hobson, Samir Amin. They all have a general concept of labor aristocracy. They differ slightly in the definitions, like the way they define it. Some of them at certain times have defined almost the entire working classes of the imperial core, as being a labor aristocracy that have fundamentally shifted interests, that they are not aligned with the global proletariat. Others don't think like this. It's very complicated, but the point of the reason that I'm even mentioning the fact that there's so many different authors that have discussed this is because some people, usually post-left garbage, but also some Marxists, they usually Marxists of the imperial core, funnily enough, will disagree and be like, oh, this is just something new that they've come to, which it isn't. This is something as old as Marxism itself. The first formulation of this began with Marx, Engels, and Lenin, to bring in the Leninist aspect, because it's the most important one. Okay, one of these, or to quote him, basically, loosely to define what he believed, is that the consequences, one of the most important consequences of imperialism when it first took off, was that it fundamentally shifted or impacted these class structures of imperialist countries. At his time, this meant France, this meant Germany, this meant England, etc. In that, basically, these benefits of imperialism, as previously mentioned, rather than being restricted only to the ruling classes of these countries, are instead spread amongst these other classes within these societies, these imperialist societies, which include the working class. And as a result, would result in basically them shifting their allegiances somewhat. And to quote, to give you just one quote from Lenin. I'm sorry, this is a quote heavy fucking episode, but in something that Lenin said in Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, which by the way is a great read, he says, "Why does England's monopoly explain the temporary victory of opportunism in England?" This opportunism meaning that the break with proletarian internationalism, being pro-empire and pro-war in the UK, or in England particularly. He says, because monopoly yields super profits, the capitalists can devote a part, and not a small one at that, of these super profits to bribe their own workers to create something like an alliance between the workers of the given nation and the capitalists against the other nation. This is something that Lenin has written more than 100 years ago. Another place also, this is in the preliminary draft thesis on the agrarian question, Lenin says, the industrial workers cannot accomplish their epoch-making mission of emancipating mankind from the yoke of capital and from wars if they confine themselves to their narrow craft or trade interests, and smugly restrict themselves to attaining an improvement in their own conditions, which may sometimes be tolerable in the petty bourgeois sense. This is exactly what happens to the labor aristocracy, quote-unquote, of many advanced countries, who constitute the core of the so-called socialist parties of the Second Internationale, which by my God, does that slap. The way he words things are so beautiful. This is the fundamental core of the point. And this is only as deep as we're getting today, because if we were to get any deeper, this episode is going to go on for like fucking 4 hours. There are certain sections of the working classes within the imperial core that are labor aristocrats. How big is this section? What are the relations to the working class movements abroad, and what are the current goals of the working class movement? Is there even a possibility for unity within the proletarian movement? How do strategies differ in the political core and the economic core, in the economic periphery, etc., etc.? These are questions that go way deeper, way beyond the scope of this episode today. But fundamentally, I'll give you just my very quick idea on the political approach, because that's the only thing that really matters, aside from all the other stuff, which is just basically reading theory. I've said this previously on episodes here and on the videos I make. I think that the political approach within the imperial core should be, of course, to start organizations, to agitate, educate, organize, to increase the drive for unionization, etc. But the fundamental thing is to resist imperialism at all costs, to start anti-organizations, to resist imperialism, and to support third world or imperial periphery movements, because this will in turn strengthen those imperial periphery movements so that they can have revolutions of their own. Once they do end up being successful, they can break the value chains, they can break the links of imperialism, they can reduce the dependence of the imperial periphery on the imperial core, number one, and number two, they will increase the dependence of the imperial core on itself, and as a result, with less imperialist profit, meaning that the capitalist classes of these imperialist core countries will have to kind of turn inwards, and this will increase class struggle within these imperial core countries, which will then change the conditions and allow for revolution that way. Because otherwise, as it currently stands, it's far less likely that will happen in, for example, Canada or Norway or, I don't know, fucking Germany than it would in the Philippines or in Peru or in some other countries, likewise. So that's just generally my point, and I have some book recommendations at the end of this, but do you guys have anything to say?
I mean, I agree with you completely. I just don't think there should be a sense of intense class antagonism between the working classes of the developing world and what we could define as the labor aristocracy, for one very simple reason. Even if you find yourself listening to this or reading find yourself as someone who could materially be placed in the position of the labor aristocracy, you need to remember everything that Hakim just quoted from Lenin, and that is that the material conditions in your country have been created due to outwards imperialism by said state that you happen to live in. So to an extent, you are a consequence of the system in which you're operating in, and you should not apply liberal morality to now starting to feel bad about yourself as if you're a capitalist, etc., but not only from like stupid moralistic reasons. We talked about this like 700 times on this podcast, but like the capitalist class has a tendency to self-cannibalize, and not even self-cannibalize, but cannibalize all other classes which do not necessarily fit into the proletariat. So the second, as Hakim beautifully put, the second the imperial core can no longer extract wealth out of the developing world, some of the first motherfuckers that are going to go are people such as yourself. So even from the most selfish, self-taking care of perspective, in the long run, if you have a fucking inch of a brain, you should identify closer with the proletariat and with proletarian movements, because you quite literally have a lot more to gain from them in the inevitable crumbling of capitalist states, which are built on top of imperialism. But as again, I'll say it again, as Hakim said, this is like insanely complicated, and it could take like 17 episodes just to discuss. I just wanted to leave like our audience, especially those who would, for example, maybe be defined as labor aristocratic, with the notion that the Marxist movement in general isn't kicking you out of the cool kids club, okay? One could say that it's not even kicking potential capitalist class traitors out of the cool kids club. It is a very open-handed movement, except for reactionaries, obviously. So don't feel like it's a direct attack at you. We're just explaining how one material thing causes another, and then creates, in this case, a potentially separate class which you happen to be in. Doesn't mean you're a bad motherfucker, or that you should stop listening to this podcast and go listen to Joe Rogan instead.
Please don't. Please.
Yeah.
I've just been over here quietly thinking about the thing you said, Hakim, about how there are some people with the take that more or less the entirety of the imperial core falls into the labor aristocracy category. And I've seen that a couple people say that on Twitter as well, and I don't think I agree with that. I understand that perspective in that overall the people of places like the United States have a fairly comfortable existence comparatively, based on the exploitation of the developing world, et cetera, et cetera. But there are still places in the United States where there's no clean running water, where there's barely electricity, where there's no access to the internet, where you don't have paved roads. For like Appalachian mining towns, or what used to be mining towns, where a Walmart has come in, and that's the only employer, and so everybody in the community sells their life to Walmart. So there are there's nuance in this conversation too, and it's something to consider. Not that I was accusing anybody here of thinking that, but just for people listening who might not be super familiar with the United States, there is a spectrum there of relations to the means of production. There are definitely what we'd call labor aristocrats in the U.S., and probably a larger percentage of the population here than in other places. But there are also, run-of-the-mill proletarians, run-of-the-mill lumpenproles, stuff like that. So it's definitely an interesting conversation, and one that definitely requires a much longer episode.
Exactly right. And of course, just to add, and this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give some book recommendations. The last thing to add on to that very beautifully put bit from JT is that that's, of course, not forgetting all the other nationalities, all the other nations that exist within the United States. The very fact that when people usually bring up this concept of labor aristocracy, they think of mostly, white upper middle class people, which is the wrong way of thinking about it. And to claim that the entire working class in the US is labor aristocratic it rests on some strange presuppositions, and particularly on the basis of this aspect. And that's why, for example, when you see the people on Twitter, they're kind of very black and white, but when you read the writings of the theoreticians on this stuff, you see that there is so much nuance in what they say, that even those who claim, or like you could make an argument that they think the vast majority of the working class, they give many caveats. So it's interesting it's a very interesting discussion. And the thing I really like about this is that this is a developing sphere of Marxist theory, which is very exciting, I think. The Monthly Review School is the one that's kind of really up to date on this stuff. They've published lots of interesting work regarding this. I'm going to give a bunch of recommendations, book recommendations. Doesn't mean you guys need to read all of these, but this is just for the people who are interested. The works that you have to absolutely read if you're going to pick something up are two works, both of them from Zach Cope, Z-A-K, Cope, C-O-P-E. Divided World, Divided Class is his first one, and his second one is The Wealth of Some Nations, which are both absolutely amazing works. There's a work by John Smith, which is called Imperialism in the 21st Century, which is also highly relevant. Samir Amin, S-A-M-I-R, and Amin is A-M-I-N, and he has many books, Law of Worldwide Value and a bunch of other stuff, which you can, Unequal Development too, which you can look into. So just write his name. Emmanuel Arguri is also very good, but it's a bit kind of old now, but still I think it's something you should give a look into. His name is Emmanuel, and his last or first name, I don't fucking know, is spelled A-R-G-H-I-R-I. The one book I would recommend you read, because it's a very interesting political introduction, is one he wrote in collaboration with the Communist Working Group, titled Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism, which you can find online. All of these you can find online if you want to. There's other books that I could recommend, but that's enough for now. You guys go, have fun. This is your homework reading. I'm gonna expect essays from everybody. I'm gonna be grading them. There is negative marking, so no, I'm teasing.
Wow, reactionary school systems. Yeah, spits on ground.
With all that said, I apologize for how heavy this episode was. It was a lot more theory driven. It was a lot more, it was a bit less funny, but hopefully you guys learned a lot. Hopefully you guys found this fun. Please let us know if you like this sort of stuff, or if it was way too much so we can scale it down in the future.
Nah, shut the fuck up. You need to learn something here, not just talk about dicks.
I mean, that's true, but I'm trying to be nice, but I completely agree with you, Gopnik. That being said, this wouldn't have been possible at all without our amazing patrons. So thank you to all of you people. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. For those of you guys who aren't patrons, I saved you the $10, so you should, send something out. I'm teasing. This has been the D Program. I'm Hakeem.
I'm JT.
And I'm Gopnik.
What was that pause? Oh, fuck.